The Americans trained me. And after being committed for so many years, I just don't believe that the Americans are going to retrograde and leave the country.
How long did it take to make Retrograde? I mean, it's somewhat unclear inception, but roughly several years. The film documents the period from January of 2021 to August 2021. So we were there for many months within that time period, and used a Canon C500. I've always shot on Canon. They've been incredibly supportive of me, and I've basically evolved as the Canon sort of C300 cameras have evolved.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mujahideen o malguru am sangaran assalamu alaikum.
Several years ago, I sort of had this very cliched question of sort of why do we fight wars, and something I was pondering, and reached out to some friends in the military community and tried to get access with one group within the Army. And then I connected with my producing partner, Caitlin McNally, who had previously worked for the Green Beret community. That's where we ended up working to get access, and took several years. By the time we started filming, it went from this sort of portrait of a Green Beret deployment, humanizing that experience, to wow, actually we can maybe tell the story of the end of the war in Afghanistan through the prism of this deployment. When I was 21 years old, I heard a mentor of mine say, if you end up with the story you started with, then you weren't listening along the way, which is good advice for life, good advice for filmmaking. Be open to the story changing, don't be dogmatic. And certainly that was the case with Retrograde. It shifted and altered many times. It went, initially from this portrait of the Green Berets to this portrait of General Sami Sadat, who was in charge of all of southern Afghanistan for the Afghan army. And, he had been working alongside the Green Berets. And when President Biden pulled out our troops, I sort of left with do we have a film here? It feels like the sort of first act. It feels like the beginning of the story, but certainly the story was not over at that point. And so that's when we shifted the focus to General Sadat and ended up embedding with him and his men all the way through the sort of final stretch of the war. People always ask me sort of why people take part in documentaries, and it's often the same common denominator, whether it's previous films I've made on the war, the drug war in Mexico, or ISIS in Syria, or COVID. People want to be heard. People want to be understood. There was a perception amongst American politicians, at least, that the Afghan army was ill prepared, and I think he wanted to also show that they fought. They fought to the very end.
You discussed why General Sadat wanted to be filmed, but I'm curious, what were your takeaways of General Sadat, having spent so much time with him?
I found him to be an incredibly compelling character. He's not what you think of when you think of a two-star general, at least what I think of. He stopped smoking, yet he has this very commanding presence and this sort of very mysterious aura around him. And I think I was really drawn to that. In some ways, the film is a meditation on every sort of metaphorical neon sign was saying to him, stop, give up, the country's falling, surrender. And he just had this unwavering faith that maybe, just maybe, if he held on to Helmand or Lashkar, the country would hold together up until the very end. That was tough to witness, because a big part of why the Afghan army lost was there's a huge loss of morale once the Americans left. And so a big part of General Sadat's job, in some sense, was convincing people, convincing his men, convincing people he was recruiting into the Afghan army that they could win. And that's obviously part of the narrative tension of the film.
one of the earliest or pretty compelling scene is when your camera's in helicopter. Talk me through the thought process of hopping in that helicopter, knowing it's going to be under fire. Do you ever second guess yourself? How do you make decisions in those kind of tense moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people say I'm, an adrenaline junkie, or I couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, I have fear like everybody else has fear, and I'm as emotional and sensitive as the average person, probably, if not more so. And these conflict zones, these films, these moments affect me deeply. I suffer from PTSD. I have nightmares almost every single night. So I don't like get off on being shot at or being in a helicopter. You have to make these risk reward decisions. Is the reward worth the risk? What is it? What is that balance? What is your red line? And I think the key when you're working in dangerous situations is to not become complacent with the danger. The second you become complacent with the danger, you start making really bad decisions. That being said, there are moments like getting on that helicopter when there was a significant chance that we were going to get shot at. I mean, the Taliban had surrounded the town that we were trying to resupply. They likely knew that we were coming, so it was scary. Like it was a good chance that they were going to get shot at. And when you're in a Black Hawk, it's so loud, like you cannot hear a thing, and it's pitch black. I'm shooting with night vision. I didn't know exactly what was happening. I couldn't hear the rockets being fired at, but rockets were being fired at us from the ground as we were trying to land. And all I could feel was the helicopter twisting and turning to avoid getting hit by the rockets. And then obviously the men inside the helicopter returning fire. It wasn't until I got back that I totally understood how close the call was and how lucky we were to be alive. I don't travel with security. We're not protected. We are completely, we have zero agency.
My father's imprisonment made me think that I will never get my father back. Everyone that was imprisoned has disappeared or was hanged by the Taliban.
I found myself in cars with General Sadat as suicide bombers were trying to attack him, going to the front lines as bullets were flying towards our car, in Black Hawk helicopters as, the Taliban was shooting rockets trying to hit us. Plenty of terrifying moments, but, I have zero agency. I can't control my fate. I'm completely at the whim of the documentary gods and or the protection of the soldiers that I'm with. And so, what I choose to focus on in those moments is my camera. That's the only thing I can control. So I focus on focusing. I focus on exposing, on aperture, and that sort of calms me down in those moments. But again, in those moments, all I'm focusing on is shooting. Making sure I'm telling this visual story. Because if I'm going to risk my life and be in that situation, I'm sure as hell better like cover it well. In mid-August, we wanted to go back and film General Sadat, and experts, pundits, whatever, were saying that like it would be 2-3 months, maybe 6 months until the Taliban, potentially won. By the time we got to Dubai, things were starting to fall quite rapidly, and we took off for Kabul. And as we descended into the valley of Kabul, the pilot got on the intercom and said, we can't land. There's a plane on the tarmac. And we're so low that all of our phones started to ping, 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 ping. And we got all these news alerts that the Taliban had taken over Kabul, and that plane on the tarmac was the president fleeing. And I just thought it was the greatest journalistic failure of my entire career, that we'd spent 8 months building to this moment. The country, this is the final chapter. The Taliban took over, the cycle came full circle, and our main participant, our main subject, was in the center of it all, General Sadat, and I'm sitting in a hotel in Dubai. We eventually basically spent every waking minute, an hour, trying to figure out how to get back into Kabul. But by the time we did, General Sadat had been forced to flee. He was a massive target on his head from the Taliban. And so we landed at the airport, and sort of once again, we're presented with a situation. what is the story we're telling? You know, with every door that closes, another door opens. With every failure comes an opportunity. And the opportunity here was to open up the aperture of the storytelling to show the civilians that the Green Berets were fighting for, to show the civilians that General Sadat and his men were fighting for. I filmed a lot of very sad things over my career, and I've certainly cried, you know, on airplanes or in the edit room or whatever at film festivals. I've never cried while filming. And then that scene at the Abbey Gate, as thousands of civilians were packed like sardines in a sewage ditch 4 feet deep, and 18-year-old Marines were making these impossible Sophie's choice decisions on who to let in and who not to let in. As the Taliban was 100 yards away, watching us at gunpoint, as ISIS was circling around us with suicide vests waiting to attack, which happened 12 hours later in that very same spot. Just had tears streaming down my face, and you know, kept having to wipe the lens down. And all I could think about at that moment was sort of, you know, what have we done?
Do you find yourself ever compelled to act in those situations, or compelled to get involved, to remove yourself from behind the lens?
Historically, not. In this instance, yes. You know, the scene where there's thousands of people sort of pushing up against that cement wall, I made the decision that, you know, I didn't want to just shoot it from behind. You know, I wanted to be up close. I wanted to feel like what it felt like to be in that crowd. And, you know, honestly, that was probably one of the more terrifying things I've ever experienced. Was it was like a very, very high likelihood of a stampede. I was trying to, you know, I was filming it, but I constantly found myself trying to calm the crowd around me, because there's zero chance that the door was open. There was no door to open. Like, they weren't getting through that gate, and they'd already shut the gate a day before. And so I just was trying to calm them down and express that, like, you're not going to get through, so please stop pushing, because there's little kids around. And, like, more so than me getting trampled, I was also terrified that these kids were going to get trampled. And then, you know, one other example was, you know, that opening scene of the film. We arrived at a different gate on a different night, and there's chaos, absolute chaos, gunfire everywhere, screaming, honking, you know. And right away, this guy grabbed me. I didn't know if it was Taliban. I don't know who it was. I mean, he had a gun, and he started dragging me through the crowd, through the gate, into this alleyway. And, you know, it was like a sort of movie moment. I'm just sitting there in this sort of dark alleyway being like, this is not good. I'm either going to get beaten or kidnapped. And then sort of out of the shadows walks this big burly American guy in this gruff voice. And he says, with expletives, "What are you doing out there? You're going to die. You're going to get yourself killed. You're an idiot." Well, went from a very antagonistic conversation. I explained to him that, you know, I've been telling the story for 8 months. It was embedded with the Green Berets. And, you know, he said, by the end, he's like, "Here's my number. If you want to get out, call us." And, you know, at that point, we made the decision to leave the wire, to leave the airport, not knowing whether we'd be able to get back in. And so this was finally a way to get back in. And he called us the next day and said, "We're shutting this gate in 30 minutes. Get over here." And so we were on the opposite side of town. We drove as fast as possible. I also wanted to get my Afghan field producers and translators out. And so we mobilized them and got them to the gate and got them through, and their families. And honestly, more so than the film itself, I'm most proud that we were able to get them out of the country, and that they're now safely in the US.
I want to live long enough to see peace in our country, spend time with my family, grow old in Afghanistan, and ultimately die in Afghanistan.